Come closer, friend. The night is thick and the wind has a bite to it. But our fire is warm, and the woods, for now, keep their distance. Take a seat. There's room enough for one more. Out here beneath these ancient trees, stories cling to the shadows like mist. Some are meant to be warnings. Some are just meant to keep you company till dawn. Rest your legs, feel the heat in your hands, and listen close. For in these wild places, the line between myth and memory is thinner than you think. Let me tell you a story I heard not long ago. They say there's a place in the woods where no birds sing, where even the wind refuses to stir the trees. A place so ancient, so cursed, that the ground itself remembers every scream ever swallowed by its mossy roots. Tonight, let me tell you of that place. Not every tree in Scotland is safe to touch. In the hills above Aberfoyle stands one known only as the fairy tree. Locals say if you pass it, you leave an offering, a ribbon, a coin, a token of respect. Fail to do so, or worse, walk it, and the fae will follow. 4 boys laughed at that warning. By the end of the weekend, not one of them returned. So gather close to the fire, traveller. If you've got the nerve, I promise you'll remember it the next time you dare enter the woods on a moonless night. It's been said more than once, and always in a lowered voice, that certain places in Scotland don't simply hold stories, they hold grudges. They wait. They remember. They choose when to act. In the high country above Aberfoyle, there's one such place. It lies hidden in a clearing, where the grass grows in uneven swells, and the air seems to press down on you, as though something unseen is weighing upon your shoulders. There stands an old rowan tree, older than anyone living can recall. The locals call it the fairy tree, but not in the way of children's books. There's nothing sweet nor glittering about it. This is the old kind of fairy tree, the kind bound up in back and punishment, the kind that doesn't forgive and won't forget. The custom, as the story goes, is simple. If you pass that way, you show respect. You leave an offering, a strip of cloth, a bead, a token of food, something to acknowledge the unseen ones said to dwell nearby. In return, you may pass untroubled, but take from the tree, or mock its offerings, and it's said the fae will know. And once they've noticed you, they will follow. Through day, through night, until you're no longer yours to keep. The story I was told happened not so many years ago, to 4 boys from Stirling, out for a weekend of camping before the summer's end. It's said they laughed at the warnings. It's also said they didn't return. The fairy tree stood apart from the rest of the forest, almost as though the other trees had learned to keep their distance. Its trunk was warped with age, twisting back in itself in unnatural curves, and its roots rose through the earth like the rib bones of something long dead. The bark was grey and furrowed, scarred in places with the faint marks of knives, though the freshest cuts had long since grown over. Its branches were heavy with offerings, hundreds of them, layered over decades. Strips of cloth faded and frayed by sun and wind. Thin cords with beads strung along them, their colours dulled. Tiny rusted coins, tied in place with string. A newer thing, bright and vivid, left by hands who still believed the warnings. A child's hair ribbon, a silver earring, the small tin lid of a candle. When the wind moved through them, trinkets gave off a faint, dry sound. Not quite a rattle, not quite a whisper. It was a sound that caught in the ear and stayed there. Generations had known the tree, and generations had left it undisturbed. But the story says that late one August, 4 boys wandered into the clearing and treated the old custom with contempt. It was the first time in living memory the fairy tree had been tested in such a way. The boys came up from Stirling by bus, their packs slung over their shoulders, the last days of summer clinging to them in that restless, aimless way teenagers carry. Each had a different reason for being there, though the story doesn't dwell on their thoughts, only on the kind of lads they were. Mike was the oldest at 18, the natural centre of gravity. People tended to follow him, not always because they wanted to, but because he had that pull, that unspoken confidence that whatever he said would be the plan. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a kind of swagger that drew some in and made others bristle. Bill, 17, was the opposite sort of leader, the kind who threw himself headlong into whatever looked fun, dangerous, or stupid, just to see what would happen. He was quick with a grin and quicker with trouble, the kind who laughed loudest at the wrong moment. Jim, also 17, was quieter. He watched more than he spoke, had a way of noticing things others didn't. Those who knew him said he had sense, though, in a group like theirs, sense didn't always carry weight. Dan was the youngest, 16, and still all elbows and knees. He hated being the one at the bottom of the age order, always trying to prove he could keep up, or even outdo the others. In the telling, people say that's why he so often followed Bill's lead. By the time they reached the clearing, the light was slanting low between the trees, turning the air to a haze of gold and shadow. The forest around them was still in a way that felt unnatural. Not simply quiet, but empty, as though the living things had gone elsewhere. Even the midges that plagued the hills in the summer were absent. The tree stood there, not far from where the clearing began, its trinkets catching what light was left. The say Jim noticed it first, his eyes drawn to the ribbons twisting in the still air, some so high they must have been tied years ago. The others treated it differently. Bill, with his restless energy, pulled down one of the older ribbons, a strip of faded blue silk, and tucked it into his pocket. Ike looked on without concern, his confidence untouched by the thought of unseen consequences. Dan, perhaps uncertain, glanced between them, but in the end followed their lead. The tent was pitched a few dozen yards away, just within sight of the fairy tree's silhouette. As the sun dipped lower, the shadows from its twisted branches stretched long across the grass, reaching toward the fire they began to build. The air in the clearing was cooler than it had been on the trail, the kind of cool that seeps into the skin. By the time the first flames took hold, the gold light of day was gone, leaving the clearing in muted greys and the tree line in a deep, heavy black. That first night in the clearing began like many camping nights do. The tent staked down, the fire fed until it burned high, the smell of smoke drifting low and clinging to their clothes. They cooked food over the flames, the scent of charred meat hanging in the stillness. For a time, the mood was light. But the story says Jim kept glancing into the tree line. The darkness beyond the fire's reach seemed to lean closer than it had earlier. The shapes of the trees crowded together as if conspiring. The forest had a silence to it that was just wrong. There was no rustle of small creatures, no call of an owl, not even the faint hiss of a breeze through the leaves. The only sounds came from the fire, the occasional pop of sap in the wood, the whispering crackle as the flames gnawed away at it. And then, from somewhere beyond the clearing, came another sound. It was faint, almost hidden under the fire's crackle. A thin, low humming. At first it could have been mistaken for the wind, but the notes rose and fell in deliberate patterns, more like a tune than a gust. The telling says it was distant, as if many voices were humming together far away. They dismissed it as something harmless. Still, the fire seemed to burn down faster than it should have. The flames sank quickly, their glow shrinking into embers that pulsed red in the ash. Their surrounding dark seemed to swell and press inward, the shapes of the trees flattening into a wall of blackness. When they finally crawled into their sleeping bags, the cold had settled deeper into the clearing. That was when the humming returned. It was softer this time, but closer, as though the unseen singers had taken several steps forward. The sound followed them into sleep, threading through their dreams like a distant, unbroken note. Morning came slow and grey in the clearing, the air heavy with the smell of damp soil and cold ash. The light that filtered through the treetops had a muted, silvery cast, as though the sun had chosen not to touch that part of the forest. Mike was the first to start. The story says he stepped outside the tent, expecting the sharp bite of fresh air, but instead was met with something strangely still. No birdsong, no insects, only the faint, distant creak of a tree trunk shifting somewhere far off. It was then that he saw their food bag lying open on the ground, its contents scattered, crisp packets torn but not shredded, biscuit wrappers pulled apart, and edges neat rather than ragged. Whoever or whatever had been through them had taken care, untying knots instead of snapping them. Bill assumed it was the work of foxes, but Jim noted that foxes don't work in silence, and they certainly don't open a bag as neatly as a person might. The ground around the campsite seemed oddly undisturbed. No paw prints, no drag mark, just the faint, dew-darkened impression of small shapes in the grass that didn't match the step of any animal they knew. And then there was the tree. The ribbon that Bill had taken the day before was gone from his pocket. In its place on the fairy tree's lower branch now hung something that had not been there when they arrived. It was a small figure, no longer than a man's hand, crafted from twigs bound with tight, careful loops of red thread. Moss formed its head, and woven into that moss were 4 short, sharp thorns, arranged like a crown. The figure seemed to watch the clearing in silence, though it had no eyes. In the telling, people always mentioned the hair around it, a faint metallic tang in the cold morning air, like the scent of blood diluted in water. Bill took it down without hesitation and threw it into the fire. The moss hissed and popped in the flames, releasing a smell that was not the clean green scent of woodland plants, but something deeper, like earth freshly turned after a rain, with a sour undertone of rot. From somewhere deep in the trees, something laughed. It was high and thin, a sound that wavered as if caught between voices. Those who recount the story say it was unlike any bird or animal, and carried a note that was far too human to be anything natural. The boys decided to leave the clearing for a few hours, setting off along a narrow path that wound deeper into the forest. At first the air seemed fresher away from the fairy tree, but as they walked, the atmosphere began to change. The further they went, the closer the trees leaned in overhead, their branches knitting together into a tangled canopy that turned the daylight into something thin and washed out. The trail became slick underfoot, not with mud, but with a layer of decaying leaves that gave slightly when stepped on, as though there were hollows underneath. Every so often, they would pass tree trunks marked with deep grooves, some fresh and pale, others dark with age, but none that looked like the work of an axe. The air grew damp, clinging to their skin and hair. Somewhere along the way, Dan glanced into the shadows between two leaning pines and saw a flicker of movement, a small, pale shape slipping behind the tree. When he looked again, nothing remained but the slow sway of the lower branches. No wind stirred the leaves. Even their own footsteps seemed muted, swallowed by the moss that spread thickly across the forest floor. Now and then, they heard faint rustles from deeper in the undergrowth, but the sound never came from the same place twice. By the time they turned back toward camp, the light had shifted in a way that didn't match the hour. It was still early afternoon, yet the clearing ahead seemed to lie under a dull, colourless haze, as though the sun had dimmed just for that one patch of ground. The fairy tree's branches moved gently, though the air all around them was perfectly still. In the telling, it said that Jim stopped at the very edge of the clearing, unwilling to step in at first. He felt, though couldn't see, that something had changed. The clearing no longer felt like an open space. It felt enclosed, the tree line tighter, the shadows denser. But the others pressed on. They returned to the tent, the tree looming at the edge of their vision, its ribbons fluttering in no wind at all. At night, the fire burned low despite the constant feeding of fresh wood. The flames seemed to withdraw into themselves, their light pulling tight around the boys, as if the darkness beyond had grown heavier and more solid. Shadows stretched across the clearing in strange shapes, distorting as they reached toward the tent. They were too long for the height of the flames, and moved with a sluggishness that didn't match the flicker of the fire. The forest gave nothing back, no sound, no stirring of leaves, yet the air felt charged, like the quiet before a storm. Bill began tossing stones into the tree, his laughter sharp and loud, but it fell flat in the heavy air. Dan joined in with a thinner sound that seemed forced. Jim, watching the fire, noted how quickly each fresh branch blackened, as though the flames were being drained of life. It was near midnight when the first tapping began. Light at first, like the soft touch of fingertips against the side of the tent. Then it moved, tap, 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 along the scenes, circling them. The sound quickened, and from the grass came another noise, faint crunches, the rhythm uneven, as though many small feet were moving in careful step. The story says that a slow scraping followed, something sharp dragging its way from one side of the tent to the other, pausing midway as if to listen. Then the laughter came. The same high, thin sound they had heard before, only closer now. Too close. Bill's patience broke first. He stepped out with a torch in hand, the beam cutting through the clearing and landing on what the story describes as dozens of faces, small, pale, and perfectly still. Their cheekbones jutted sharply, their smiles wide enough to show too many teeth. None of them blinked. The torchlight wavered, dimmed, then died, leaving him in the dark. From that darkness, something darted forward, low and fast, and seized his ankle. It was not the grip of a human hand, but something narrow and cold. Bill's cry was short and startled before he was yanked into the tree line. The sound of him stumbling turned into struggling, then to raw, panicked screams. What followed was worse. A wet, tearing sound, cut short into silence. Inside the tent, the others heard only the muffled, windless quiet that followed. Then, fabric began to bulge inward from every side. Small, pale hands pressed against the nylon, dozens of them, stretching it to its limit. Fingers hooked and pulled, distorting the shape until the seams strained, and one split with a loud rip. Through the gap, more hands reached in, seizing Dan by the hair and wrists. He kicked and thrashed, but his limbs were pulled outward with sudden, unnatural strength. Jim lunged towards him, but in the last glimpse before Dan vanished, his eyes were wide and pleading. Then he was gone into the dark. His voice was cut short by the sound of breaking, snapping, and the wet crunch of something not meant to be heard. Mike took the lead then, gripping his knife and crawling them out through the back of the tent into the open clearing. The air was thick and cold. Shapes moved in the periphery, quick, darting things that never came fully into view. The laughter rose and fell around them, never from the same direction twice. They ran toward the tree line, but the ground shifted beneath Mike's foot. It gave way like wet sand, and pale hands erupted from the earth, clawing up around his leg and dragging him down. His knife flashed once in the dark before the soil closed over him completely, swallowing his last cry. Jim was alone. The forest fell silent once more. Even the laughter stopped, as though holding its breath. From between the trees, a figure emerged, taller than the others, impossibly thin, crowned with a woven ring of thorns. Its face was hidden in shadow, but it raised one long finger and touched the fairy tree trunk. At once, the roots at Jim's feet began to move. They twisted and curled upward, wrapping around his leg and pulling him toward the tree. The branches bent low, their ribbon ends brushing against his face. A voice entered his head, not through his ears, but deeper, like a thought that wasn't his own. It spoke only two words. We remember. The roots tightened and Jim was gone. A week later, two hill walkers, a man and his teenage daughter, strayed from the main path. They came into the clearing looking for a place to rest, but what they found stayed with them for the rest of their lives. The tent still stood, its ropes taut, its flaps swaying slightly as though disturbed only moments before. Inside, sleeping bags lay unzipped, their fabric bearing the faint impressions of bodies long absent. Clothes were scattered in positions that suggested movement cut short, a hoodie half pulled inside out, a pair of trainers lying at odd angles. The fire pit was nothing but a circle of fine grey ash, but undisturbed, as if sheltered from the wind. The food bag was still torn open, its contents untouched by insects. Air around it carried a cloying sweetness with a faint metallic tang beneath. On the fairy tree hung 4 new twig figures. Each bore a crown of thorns, and burned into its small wooden body a set of initials: MB, BR, JM, DK. The daughter claimed one of them twitched, though the air was still. That was when the ribbons began to move. Their ends lifted and trembled as though plucked by unseen fingers. The sound started soft, a rustling like fabric brushing fabric, but grew sharper. It became whispering, a language neither walker understood, its rapid syllables carrying an edge of mockery and anger. Beneath it, faint but undeniable, came the echo of distant screaming. The pair fled without looking back, and when they reached the village and tried to speak of it, they found themselves shaking. An old local overheard and told them only this: some places let you leave. Be glad this was one of them. Stories always ended with the same warning. If you ever find yourself near Aberfoyle and you come upon the fairy tree, don't touch it, don't take from it, and don't mock it. The Fae don't forget, and they certainly don't forgive. If they choose to notice you, no distance will be far enough, and no hiding place will be deep enough. They will wait, with a patience older than the stones beneath your feet. And should you ever hear laughter in the trees, high, thin, and far too close, followed by a whisper that says, "We remember," the time for running has already passed. So remember this tale, friends. The fairy tree of Aberfoyle is not just a story whispered to frightened children. It stands there still, its branches heavy with ribbons, coins, and tokens left by those wise enough, or fearful enough, to pay their respect. If ever you should wander those hills, don't take lightly what waits in the clearing. Leave an offering, step softly, and above all, never mock the old ways, for the Fae don't forgive, and they never forget. If you enjoyed tonight's story, make sure you leave your own offering here. A like, a comment, or a share, so that Sam Haynes' fire may burn a little longer. And if you dare return for another tale, subscribe and join me again when the night is at its darkest. Until then, tread carefully and listen closely to the silence between the trees, because sometimes silence means something is listening back.